The apotheosis of secularism. I think this idea of science becoming akin to a religion is the most profound concept to understand within the longue durée of our contemporary civilizational period. A continual search for truth being slowly eclipsed by the protection of the dogmatism espoused by the heralded expert class. I believe this is conclusive as an example that, like our archaic developmental periods, it seems as though the priest class very much hold the central power. They control the enfeebled of mind and direct them like cattle to the pen they have prefabricated for them. Look at it too in terms of the climate change escapade that has been ongoing. The scientists, the priest class, know of certain ecological and climatic changes before they happen, or they plan or manipulate it as such through technology or statistical lying. See ClimateGate in 2012, and they then predict or prognosticate upon these various future happenings as a means of projecting a divine or enlightened status to the commoners. Once the said ecological or climatic change occurs, in the midst of this predicted climatic event, there shall be chaos abound, and people will cry out for order. Who will they turn to? The experts, and the experts will already be aware of the terminus of this naturally occurring event. In this case, ecological or climatic changes, but they will not let the laity know of this fact directly. Thus, they will require of the laity a sacrifice. This may be financial, sanguine-like, or simply power of some description, and, while enthralled to fear and hysteria, in the midst of chaos, the laity will be all too happy to oblige. This is all akin to the old workings of this same method, that being when the priest class understood and used to best effect eclipses, where the laity believed that the sun had gone, and the only way to ensure it would return was to beg the priest class to return it. Hence, the priest class entered a type of apotheosized state in the eyes of the laity. Naturally, this stems from the need of the human, at least the more efficiency-oriented, mechanical minds of the species, to control and domesticate nature. Domestication is a strange abstraction, resultant from the bio-spiritual chemistry of the human psyche. The need for some to wish to perfect the already perfect paradise by the supposed ingenuity of the imperfect mind. It is the need to extract efficiency via a remoteness of producing for oneself from the profiting passively of another's products. However, it has led us to great feats of technology and learning via the satiating of the urban population's basic necessities of life. But this slow incline towards greatness for the species, in a sense, has paved the way for our self-annihilation. The self-annihilation of which we are in the throngs of currently can trace its roots back to the upper class, who were created from the same mechanical men who sought domestication and the endless pursuit of efficiency. This mentality has transferred itself from the first sedentary agriculturalists to the modern-day despotic technocrats. Both parties wished for the same thing. They share a genetic as well as an intellectual lineage. They wish only for the domestication of the natural world and for it to be made into the image of the efficient, of the calculatedly cold, and of the predictable. In those days of old, were the first sedentary domesticators, primarily in the Near East, sought to selectively breed cereal and animal. They sought specific traits conducive to the requirements of the product's principal efficiency and of control over its yield and behaviour. The latter being the derivation of the former. Naturally, control is what was needed, and this was comprised of control over behaviour, which saw a resultant predictability over the yield produced, that is. Within the cereal crops, the selective cultivation and growing of these saw a marked divergence between the domesticated and wild variety of these crops. For example, we find that Within the wild variety of cereals, grain will fall naturally from the ear of the plant as they ripen, and this is effective for seed dispersal. However, this trait is very much averse to the control required for domestication and thus efficiency. Hence, these cereals were selectively bred to ensure that the grain remain on the plant even after ripening. Come harvest, these plants were then typically thrashed to detach the grain. In essence, to achieve this form of domestication of cereals, they had to be isolated, studied, and their reproduction controlled through proto-scientific means to ensure that the desired traits shone through. On the other hand, we have the differences between wild and domesticated cattle. Wild cattle typically had bigger craniums, were less docile, and were more inquisitive of their environment. These traits are of no use for the purposes of domestication and of profit maximization. The thinking and less docile animal is thus more dangerous to the human farmer, is it not? Thus, through selective breeding, which was done through, again, the isolation of the domesticated from the wild, and thus the control over reproduction, we find that a totally different and inferior specimen of the species then emerged, that of a docile, low-intelligence automaton, bred for one purpose, to ensure control over a predictable and maximised yield. Now, why am I bringing this subject to the fore and going into detail on the history of domestication? Well, with what began nearly 10,000 years ago, with the manipulation of naturally occurring elements of the world, we find that the would-be, quote, human farmers, unquote, would be seeking to bring about the dream of every religion, control structure and despot of history, the total domestication and control over the human species, that is. You see, the domestication of the human is rather tricky, as most of the Homo sapien population of Earth have the ability to think in abstract terms, and this brings about notions of extreme self-awareness, which leads to the innate inclination towards free will. Free will is a problem and, unlike a lack of docility or an excess of aggressiveness, which can be bred out or reduced within animals via a number of means, humans cannot easily be made mindless automatons. Thus, to diminish free will and to ensure compliance, we find that religions and cults would be the first stepping stone on the road to total domestication. Priest classes rose up and would attempt to exert control via bedazzlement of the laity and through emotional trickery. This was rather prone to mishaps though, due to the inverse correlation seen via urbanization and increased education, which inevitably results in critical academic spheres being born out, which reduces religiosity. In time, these academic spheres create their own secular cults to divine reason, or specific intellectuals. See Scientism today within the seminal event of the rise of the technocratic age. We find that then there was a drift towards monarchy, which had divine or religious connotations too, arguably, and the implementation of taxation, which would always bring about a type of serfdom or stratified feudalism to enforce said taxation on the populace. This would utilise fear and the threat of fear, of violence and of the authority who would perpetrate said violence onto the populace. This was the equivalent of beating the goose into laying the golden egg. Alas, in time, this too failed to produce total predictability within the species. Therefore, we find that then compulsory, industrialised education was thence employed to literally mould the human from birth to fit the prescribed form, desired by the state of course. This was further buttressed with the tribulated nature of the world, as portrayed by the media. Death and destruction, the murder and mayhem, the wanton carnage and existential threats lurking around every corner. This ensured that the government provided the justification for its existence and its largely unfair and visibly immoral position at the head of the societal hierarchy. If we would but give up our free will, our fundamental duty to engage our centres of thought, then we would be saved by the government, of course. Again, This was predicated by fear. However, the only issue with the utilising of fear, which arguably all three tactics of indirect domestication do, is that certain numbers of the population eventually become resistant to the said fear and begin to see the scheme that is being perpetrated upon them. This causes a rather large and irreparable issue for the would-be domesticators, as their position is untenable and weak naturally, even if they are in possession of the most arms of war, because they rest within the confines of the paradoxically natured, urbanised metropolises. They are largely alienating to the rest of the nation, of course, of whom artificially sustain them with grain and obedience. Eventually, this breakdown between the ecological or rural support centres and the urban centres is what leads to the breakdown of civilizations. Hence, control in the administering of it onto the populace at large is of paramount importance to the ruling class. Now, the means as to which domestication shall be brought about in its totality is through the event we see today plaguing us, no pun intended, that being, like the wild animals of old destined to be domesticated, we have been penned into domestic cells, for our own good of course, forced onto diets where we are fed fodder and turned into pure grazing herbivores, our reproduction controlled and steered, and the docile and gullible are selected from the herd, via the inducement of a crisis of fear, and the said cure. This is done to bring about a population of totally controlled and pharmacologically, or drug-altered automatons. They shall be docile, lethargic, of low intelligence, and without a desire to think beyond what they shall have for tonight's dinner. Think of idiocracy, except from the fact that it shall be ruled by a small clique of unaltered pathological maniacs. This shall persist until full automation ensures that we are rendered obsolete and subject to final disposal. At that stage, which could be now mind you, we shall be unable to mount a resistance, as our domestication shall be complete and total in its disabling of our ability to defend ourselves and to see visible, credible threats. Henceforth, what we are seeing now is the continuation of the need of imperfect man to attempt to perfect the already perfected paradise we inhabit, via the supplanting of our twisted sense of efficiency and binary order onto it. Nature is ordered, but the natural order is not one of a predeterminate binary that seeks to act as the hammer, bringing uniformity to all standing nails. No, it seeks order through equilibrium, a state of being that ensures everything lives in accordance with its natural inclination, that freedom is the pursuance of the median instinct, without the impeding of others to do the same, that everything breathes life into another, into the world, that each being is its own verse in a grander play. Equilibrium is the elevation of choice. In a world of the unpredictable, it is the experiencing of the panoramic tapestry of life, of good and of bad, and the seeking of that which keeps us wanting to be alive. It is not the elevation of safety nor security, but the guarantee that there are no forced guarantees that man may persist in fulfilled symbiosis with that which comprises nature herself.